Welcome, everyone, to my review of the 2022 Netflix film All Quiet on the Western Front. Many of you have been asking for this for a while. I am finally ready to deliver. I wanted to give it a little bit of time. I first watched it when I was in Belgium on the Western Front in Ypres. I watched it with the original German, with English subtitles on, which I think is the way to watch this movie. I highly recommend that, even if you don't understand German, which I understand some, but not a ton. But I wanted to give it some time and then go back and rewatch it, which is what I did last night, because I don't want to just go off my initial impressions. So I've had a chance to watch it now for a second time. This time I watched it in English just to get a little bit of a different feel for it. So I just want to say up front before we dive into this breakdown of the film that I absolutely loved the movie. And many of the negative comments and negative reactions that I've seen to this film are primarily about the comparison to either the book that it's kind of based on, or the 1930 or 1979 versions of All Quiet on the Western Front. The 1930 version might be the best pre-1940 film ever made. And it's still probably one of the greatest films ever made, period. It really stands the test of time, and I highly recommend that you watch that version. It holds up really well for being almost 100 years old. And it's much more faithful to the source material, to the book. So I want to set all of that aside and say that I am coming at this review of the film not comparing it to the 1930 film or the 1979 film or to the book, because this is based on the book. I would say inspired by the book, but it's not an adaptation of the book. Some of the characters are there, some of the scenes and events are there, but a lot of it gets changed, removed altogether. There's some things that are added that aren't in the book at all. So I'm approaching this as a standalone thing, as though none of that other stuff existed. And my primary focus is going to be to talk about some of the history, what it gets right, what I think it portrays in a good way, and just kind of break it down. So we're going to go through some of the scenes, just going to pick some things out, and just talk a little bit about how it compares to the real history, how well I think it portrayed it. And I think by and large it does a pretty good job. There's a few issues I have, and we'll talk about that, and most of those come later in the film. But let's go ahead and dive in. So one of the things I love is that the opening scene is scenes of nature and beauty and tranquility, and then we immediately shift to this overhead shot coming down in on these frozen soldiers on the ground, and then we start to see the Western Front for the first time. We see a couple of machine gun shots hit here and there, and we go right into a scene of a fight going on between, I believe, the French and the Germans here, if I remember right, because that's primarily what we're going to see throughout this film. And we immediately get scenes of the desperation, the fear, the futility of attacking over conditions like this, as we see these guys attack. So right here, we see a guy who was in fear, and he doesn't want to go over the top. And as soon as they go over the top, guys start getting hit. Some of them don't even make it out of the trench, which is very true to how things were at times. A lot of these guys died before they ever even made it out. Now we're going to get our view of things as they start running through no man's land. You see the barbed wire everywhere. You see the holes in the barbed wire, which made for these killing zones because you knew the guys had to funnel through those areas, and so it made it easier as a machine gunner to know where to aim as these guys were coming at you. And a lot of times you'll see guys dive into any place where they could get a little protection, like a fallen tree or a hole in the ground that was caused by artillery. This movie, from start to finish, does an excellent job of examining the psyche of the soldiers. And there's a lot of very reminiscent of the D-Day scene from Saving Private Ryan in that. So after that battle scene's over, we get this view of them removing the uniforms of the dead soldiers before they bury them. And I will say this about this. The reusing of uniforms did happen. Let's acknowledge that. But I don't think it happened in the way or in the scale that is shown in this film. In fact, I think a lot of the things that they do in this film are done kind of over the top intentionally to try and convey a particular feeling or a particular emotion or give you a sense of what it would have been like. So I get that they chose to do that. But let's recognize we're talking about 1917 is where this film kind of opens up. And by 1917, Germany's got a real problem with resources in general. Supplies because of the blockade that's happened. And what I think this is doing is illustrating the level of casualties, the level of turnover that is happening at the front. And from that standpoint, it does that really well. So this scene here, we see all these schoolboys. It's 1917 at this point. We see all these schoolboys be given a speech by like their school headmaster, and I believe this is a scene that's taken from the book. It's been a long time since I read the book. And we get our first view of Paul, who's kind of our main point of view character in the story. And you see the excitement of these young men who are excited to go off to war and fight for the Kaiser and fight for the fatherland. And I will say this about this scene. I think that this makes a lot of sense if we're in 1914, 1915, which is actually when I believe this part takes place in the original story. I think by the time you get to 1917, which is what you're seeing portrayed here in the movie, there would have been a lot less of that, because by now people know how bad things are. They know how long this war's been dragging on. They know just how terrible it is. But I still like that they showed this, because you get to see the descent from excitement and patriotism to utter despair and horror when you actually arrive at the front and you see what the war is actually like. And I should mention, if you haven't already figured it out, I'm planning on showing clips while I talk about that scene and talk about background. I'm not going to play the clips and then talk afterwards. So if that's frustrating for you, just go and watch the movie, and then you can see all of this without any of my commentary over top of it. It's on Netflix. You can watch it in German, watch it in English. I think there's some other languages that are available as well. Yeah, you can see here we've got Filipinos, French, English, and Spanish, as well as subtitles in a bunch of different languages. Looks like we've also got Brazilian, Portuguese, Czech, Europe, a bunch of, so there's a lot of languages available. So the next scene we have here is we have one of these guys marching and singing. Again, definitely plenty of stories of this actually happening, in particular in 1914, when we know of situations where you have young schoolboys who have been sent to the front, particularly the German Fourth Army that goes into Ypres. And there are these famous descriptions of this army of schoolboys. The Germans have spun it as something called the Massacre of the Innocents. And I'm going to touch on that in my video from the Langemark Cemetery. It didn't quite happen like it was described by the Germans, but there were these young schoolboys who did go into battle singing. We have British examples of them singing. There's a few reasons for that. One is morale, but also it sometimes helped with unit cohesion, because in the chaos of battle, sometimes you lose track of what's going on, and so as the guys were singing, it helped them stick together a little more. So our characters that we see, these schoolboys that have gone off to war, their first experience as they get near the front with fire is, of course, artillery. And that makes total sense because artillery was the main cause of battle injuries and battle deaths in the First World War. Not bullets, not machine guns, not gas. You see them putting their gas masks on because there was a fear, anytime there was artillery coming in, that those artillery shells could be filled with gas, which was something that happened. But gas, while it was commonly used, especially on the Western Front, did not cause that many deaths. In fact, the country who suffered the most deaths from gas during the war was Russia, which was the Eastern Front, followed by Germany, and then some of the nations on the Western Front. So we're talking Russia lost like 10,000 killed to gas. So it's a pretty minor player in terms of causing deaths on the battlefield. But it was more about the fear of it and the psychological impact than necessarily killing a lot of people on the battlefield. Now they've arrived on the trenches, and he's still wearing his gas mask because he was actually being punished for something. And you notice, of course, that they're wearing what we call the Stahlhelm, the steel helmet, which we recognize as being very similar to the one that was used by the Germans in World War II. And at this point in the war, that absolutely would have been the case. These were introduced in 1916. Before that, you had the Pickelhaube, which was the helmet that had the spike on top that you see in scenes from early in the war. But by 1916, 1917, definitely would have had those familiar Stahlhelms. So now we have this scene, and this is something that we don't, I think a lot about in the war, which was the water in the trenches. There are accounts all over the place from soldiers talking about 2-3 feet of standing water in these trenches being a constant issue. Because a lot of these places, especially like in West Flanders, for example, where Ypres is, it rains a lot, and the water table is like 2 feet below the ground. And so groundwater was a constant issue. And so you see these guys like just, you think it's kind of fruitless that they're just doing this. But when you've got hours and hours in the trenches when nothing's happening, what else do you have to do but just sit there and try to bail out the water from your trench as fast as it's coming in? I remember when I first watched the movie and I saw this scene for the first time, with these guys popping their heads over the top, I kept thinking to myself, where are the snipers? Because that is not something you would have done, is to pop your head up over the trenches. Now, I do want to keep in mind, and maybe this is why, is it's nighttime by this point. And nighttime would have been a time, this is when a lot of things happened in no man's land. This is when you went out and tried to get to guys who were wounded from an attack. This is when you went out and tried to repair the barbed wire in front of your own lines. This is when you would send out scouts to try and probe and see what's going on out there. So I guess from that standpoint it's okay, but then I was kind of fulfilled a little bit because what we see is we have Paul firing his weapon we see for the first time. He shoots at a guy that he sees moving out there, and that then draws the attention of a sniper because he's fired his weapon, and there's been the muzzle flash, which has drawn attention, and he very narrowly avoids being killed. Snipers were a constant problem at the trenches. People did not pop their heads up, and so they had these periscopes, and they had different ways of being able to look over top, especially during the daytime. So now we get into the first time that we see what is described here as a creeping barrage. We see the flare being shot up to illuminate the area, and then we immediately see artillery start landing near the trenches. Now, when I first saw this scene, I took some issue with it because a couple of things they do well, first of all, is when the artillery starts, you see all of these German soldiers leave their frontline trenches and head down into these underground bunkers. And the Germans especially did have these really well dug out and maintained underground bunkers. Sometimes they were 30, 40 feet below ground. They were reinforced. They had electric lighting. Because remember, a lot of these places, like the Somme, like Ypres, the Germans and the opponents, whether it's the French or the British or others, have been in these positions sometimes for more than a year. And so they've had plenty of time to reinforce these positions. And so this is true. And these guys are undergoing this for the first time. But you have the one officer or non-com here who tells them that this is a creeping barrage. And he describes how, it kind of, the whole point of a creeping barrage was it would move forward just ahead of attacking troops. It was meant to be protection. And so you have these descriptions from the Germans of these creeping barrages, and you knew that the second the artillery stopped, that was when the attack was upon you. And so you had to be ready, and you were trained that as soon as the artillery stopped, you ran out and got into your positions. And a lot of times these Germans would describe that they had no sooner gotten to their machine guns, to man their machine guns and to man the fire steps of their trenches, than the enemy was upon them. Like, it was timed. By 1917, they had this creeping barrage thing down to where it could go just yards ahead of the soldiers. And so I feel like they got that a little bit off because the initial artillery is landing right there. But then he talks about the creeping barrage, and then it starts hitting like right at their trenches. And you see that. See, now it's landing right on top of them. And you have the scene where the one guy starts to panic, and he actually runs out, and he gets just obliterated by one of these artillery shells. So now our main focus story, Paul, we see him wake up. He's been buried under rubble from one of the artillery strikes, and he misses the attack that happens on their trench. And that's totally realistic. There were times that happened where guys got buried and had to be dug out, and sometimes were buried alive and died that way. And then we have this really powerful scene of him walking around and collecting the broken off parts of the dog tags from these German soldiers who have been killed. And that is how their dog tags work. They had the metal. And he's finding his friend's glasses here, and he comes to the realization that one of his buddies he went to war with has been killed. And it's just one of many examples where he's seeing firsthand the horror of the war. And boy, it's just a world removed from when they were all gung-ho and excited to go off and fight for the Kaiser. But yeah, the dog tags had the same thing on both pieces, and they had kind of this perforation in the middle, and you would break it off. So the one half would stay with the dead soldier so that he could be identified. And then the other half would be, turned in as proof that that soldier had been killed. So pretty powerful scene that we see there of him collecting all of these dog tags. Now keep in mind that at this point, Paul, our main character, hasn't even experienced combat. He was kind of knocked out early on of this thing. We haven't even really seen him interact with the enemy, and already we're seeing the emotional toll that this is taking on him. And so imagine months and months of this on end, what this would do to a person's psyche. And this is in a time when we don't understand things like post-traumatic stress, or what they called then shell shock, really. And there's a scene during all this where he kind of stops, and he's just breaking down, and one of his commanders comes along and says, "Hey, keep working. There's no time to mourn. There's no time to stop and really take care of your buddies the way that you wanted to. We've got to worry about the next attack. We've got to worry about getting cleaned up and getting our defenses built back up. So when the next attack happens, we're ready for it." And then what happens is we get right here, after this scene, we get a time jump of 18 months. And we're going to go from 1917 to November of 1918. And we're going to actually jump right to, I think it goes to November 7th, 1918. And we're into the last week of the war. And the majority of the film is going to happen in the last 4 days of World War I on the Western Front. Now, this guy that we see here is a real person. His name was Matthias Erzberger, and he was a fairly new member of the German government, and very reluctant to get involved in these peace negotiations. But he is sent as the primary civilian negotiator for the Germans to propose an armistice. And he's played here by the actor Daniel Brühl, who, if you've ever seen the movie Joyeux Noël, which is about the Christmas truce of 1914, he plays a German lieutenant in that movie. And I should mention about Erzberger, he was specifically chosen because he was Catholic, he was a civilian, and it was thought that he would have an easier time negotiating with the French than, say, a Prussian general would. And very sadly, to point out that Matthias Erzberger becomes, after the war, there's this huge focus on what's known as the stab in the back mythology. This idea that the military could have won the war in the field, but they were stabbed in the back by the civilian government. And this is going to be perpetrated in particular by the National Socialists as they rise to power. And Erzberger, because he was the civilian negotiator for the Germans, he becomes a target of this. And in 1921, he's actually going to be assassinated by a hit squad in retaliation for his involvement in the armistice. So now we see a scene where we got a couple of German soldiers, and again, this is 18 months later. They're scavenging, and we have a line in here where the one guy says, "When you're starving, you'll do anything." Germany by 1918, November 1918, not only the army but also the civilians, they're in a desperate situation. The Allied blockade has had just an awful effect on Germany's ability to prosecute the war, but also just to survive. And there are hundreds of thousands of civilians that are starving to death on the home front. And this is one of the main motivating factors behind the end of the war, is that Germany just cannot go on because they can't even feed their people at this point. And then there's a scene that happens not long after this where one of the guys, they see some girls out in the field, some French girls, and one of the guys goes out and starts talking to them in French. You got to figure, even if you're a German kid who has never been to France and never learned French, after a couple of years on the Western Front, you've probably picked up enough French to be able to interact with people. And he just kind of leaves in this scene, and nobody really bats an eye at this. By November 1918, Germany is facing a real crisis with mass desertions and mass surrenders happening all over the army. They're done. The German army is done fighting this war. The movie then slows down for a little while, and a lot of people talked about how they felt like maybe it dragged on a little too long, and there's a lot of this kind of slow period in the middle before we get back into a lot of action later on. And we see these Germans, they go on a patrol because there are some men that were supposed to show up who never showed up to the front, and they go and they find them all in this room. Let's see if I can find that scene. Here's the scene here where they've taken shelter because there was an artillery gas attack. And they find out that these guys, they were new, had taken their masks off too soon and all ended up dead. And that was absolutely something that could have happened because the gas, sometimes depending on what kind of gas it was, would linger for a while. And you might feel like it was safe. And some of these gases that they used didn't have a smell. And you could think that you were safe, and you weren't. And so in this case, that's exactly what happened. These guys have all died. And there's different kinds of gas that are used during the war. There's chlorine gas, which the Germans had in abundance because it was a product of their manufacturing industries that they had. There's phosgene gas, and then of course there's mustard gas, which is much tougher to protect against because it wasn't just about how you inhaled it, but it could actually affect your exposed skin as well. So now we get this scene that I'm not real crazy about. It's a German general who is not really identified as being anybody in particular, but he looks a lot like Ludendorff to me. Ludendorff and Hindenburg are brought from the Eastern Front to the West after General von Falkenhayn is replaced as chief of the German general staff, and he's sent like over to the Balkans to fight. But Ludendorff and Hindenburg, by this point in the war, are basically running a military dictatorship. They're making most of the major decisions. And we have this general that isn't identified saying he's not going to surrender, talking about how there are fresh troops that are going to be coming very soon. It's total fantasy. I'm not saying there weren't generals that might have felt that way, but the Germans had no chance at this point. They kind of had their last gasp in the spring of 1918 with what's called the Kaiserschlacht offensive, because they know that the Americans are arriving in huge numbers every month. And so their last chance to win this war on the Western Front is going to be before the Americans are in a position to really make a difference in the war. So they launch this attack. And by the time we get into late September, the real-life Ludendorff is telling the Kaiser that the Germans are done. They're not going to be able to hold against an Allied offensive. And in late September, we get a major Allied offensive. It's called the 100 Days Offensive, which is meant to kind of put an end to the war. And he tells the Kaiser in late September that they need to request a ceasefire. So the German High Command, by late September, certainly by the first week of November of 1918, they know that they're done. Now this scene's really neat because you see a lot of pictures that look exactly like this, where you've got just a couple of tree trunks that are maybe 10, 15 feet up in the air, and pretty much everything else is gone. It looks like it's the moon, and the trees have been obliterated and had everything destroyed on them. That's exactly what these places look like from all the artillery fire that has taken place at this point in the war. And then at 1:03:30, I like this scene that you see here, because this gives you a great example of what these trenches would have been like. The trenches are pretty deep at this point, and you have these guys standing on what are known as fire steps, which, if I can actually get to where you can see it, there you go. You can see how they're up high off the ground. So you would step on those when you were preparing to either defend or preparing to maybe go over the top up a ladder for an attack. And that's what they were called. They were called fire steps. So now we're going to see the scene where Erzberger and some other Germans are meeting with French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, who is the Supreme Allied Commander. He's basically the Eisenhower of World War I. And it's the French and a British representative. There are no Americans involved in these armistice negotiations that are taking place. And this is in Foch's headquarters car. And the gist of how this went down is portrayed, I think, fairly accurately in the movie. Foch shows up when the German delegation first arrives. A couple of days, I think this is like November 8th or so when this happens. And he hands them a list of demands. There's no negotiation that happens. Foch hands them a list of demands, tells them they have 72 hours to comply with the demands, and then he leaves. And we don't see Foch again interacting with the Germans until he shows up for them to sign the armistice. And that is how that really happened. The Germans, in the meantime, are trying to figure out, is there any wiggle room at all? Do we have any way of negotiating any of this stuff? And really, the only things the Germans are able to negotiate are things that are just factually incorrect in the demands. For example, one of the demands had a list of how many submarines the Germans had to basically stop using and turn over. And the Germans didn't even have that many U-boats. And so they had to correct that and say, listen, we can't give you that many U-boats because we don't have that many U-boats. So those were the kinds of things. But really, there was no negotiation that went on. This was a surrender. It really was a surrender. It was not an armistice where it was like a white peace, where everybody stood down. There were demands like they had to get out and retreat across the Rhine River. They had to pull their troops out from the other fronts. They had to turn over their navy. They had to submit to civilian authority. There were all of these things involved in this. So then what we see here, about an hour into the movie, is we see this German attack happening a couple of days before the armistice is signed. Now, listen, I am not up to speed on every single thing that happened in every single part of the line in November of 1918, but I have a really hard time believing that the Germans were launching attacks across no man's land 2 days before the armistice. The Allies were the ones who were attacking. The Germans are the ones who are pushing really hard for an armistice. The German high command knows the war's over, and they're trying to get out of it at this point. It's the Allies that are attacking. It's the Allies who are pushing, and even up to the last hour after the armistice is signed, the Allies are still launching attacks. So, I feel like this would not have been happening in November 1918. Not by the Germans. Now, one thing they really do well here, and you see these machine guns firing, they had in their defensive positions what were called interlocking bands of machine gun fire, so that the fire would overlap. And so there was crossfire happening. These machine guns, sometimes they were really close together. The American attack on Montfaucon, which is in the Meuse-Argonne offensive in late September of 1918, this small defensive position by the Germans that was attacked by about 4,000 Americans, the Americans captured 75 machine guns in that position. It's a position that's maybe a few hundred yards wide. 75. I'm not saying they were all set up, but there were 75 German machine guns in that location. And by this point in the war, I should point out as well that it's only Germany fighting. The Bulgarians, the Ottomans, the Austro-Hungarians are all out of the war. They've all made separate armistices, separate ceasefires with the Allies. So at this point, we see the Germans have taken some French frontline trenches, and you see they find food, and they're just ravenous. They're digging into it, and that's true. I mean, these guys were starving at this point. And they're just grabbing all that they can, and they're eating. And then we have this happen where you start to see everything shaking, and they all run out to the front. And I get the impression here that they're trying to show us that, like, the Germans have never seen tanks before, or that they're surprised or they're scared by this. But by November 1918, everybody knows what a tank is. Tanks are introduced to the Western Front in September 1916 at the Somme. The Germans only ever produced something like 20 tanks. They didn't really make any. They did sometimes use captured Allied tanks, but the Allies made thousands of tanks. And the first time they're really used in big numbers comes a little bit later. But what we see here, in the strictest sense of the word, is not really a tank. It's more of an armored fighting vehicle, but it's known as the French Saint-Chamond, and it's basically this big metal box that's got a 75 millimeter gun on the front of it. Now, Saint-Chamonds were not used in any attacks in November of 1918. The last use that I'm aware of these vehicles was in early October 1918 at Montfaucon, which I mentioned earlier. They were used in the American attack. The Americans didn't have their own tanks. They didn't have their own artillery. They were primarily using French tanks and artillery. The French, though, didn't use a lot of these. There were a couple of hundred of these made during the war. By this point in the war, they're primarily using the Renault light tanks because they were much more versatile for the battlefield. These Saint-Chamonds had some real weaknesses, and we see the Germans taking advantage of one of those weaknesses, where one guy runs up during this fight and he actually throws one of his these potato masher grenades up in, and they're able to destroy the tracks on one of these things. And that's true. They did have weaknesses like that. And tanks are pretty unreliable during the First World War. A lot of times they'll break down on the battlefield. So then what we see next introduced, and this is one of the major issues that I have with this movie, is the way they portray Flammenwerfers, flamethrowers. Yes, flamethrowers were definitely used during the First World War. The Germans are the first ones who primarily used these. They use them in over 600 attacks during fights on the Western Front. They were first used by the Germans in February of 1915 on a limited basis at Verdun. The first major use of flamethrowers is going to be at Ypres later that same year. But they were mostly used to flush men out of the trenches who were then shot. And they certainly were not used in any major way with guys like you see in this movie, men walking around with flamethrowers, shooting, kind of, just marching out into the open and using them like this. That would have been super dangerous, and also it would have been really very difficult because these flamethrowers, these early flamethrowers, were very difficult to maneuver with. And they were very dangerous. The chances of getting shot out in the open with one of these things are pretty high, and it was going to explode. So primarily what they would do is they would use them from their own trenches. Some of these flamethrowers late in the war had a pretty significant range, and a lot of these trenches are not that far apart during the war, and so they would launch them from their own trenches into the opposing trenches to force the guys up out of their trenches where they could shoot them out in the open. They wouldn't have been marching out in the open in an attack like this with flamethrowers. And they didn't last very long. They had a limited supply of fuel that could be used for these. Now, one thing I do really like, and this is a departure from the book, because we don't see a lot of this negotiations with the armistice, and not really negotiation, but discussions by the Germans about what to do. And you really see Matthias Erzberger saying, listen, every moment that we wait to sign this, people are dying. Because the Germans asked the French, listen, while we're negotiating this stuff, can we have a ceasefire so nobody else has to die? Can we put a stop to the fighting until we're done? And we don't get that happening. The French basically say, if you want to stop the dying, you got to sign. And they really put the pressure on them. But we see this back and forth between the Germans debating, do we sign this and basically surrender? And meanwhile, there's people dying on the front. That absolutely did happen. I believe on the last day of the war, something like 2,700 men died in the last few hours. And this was between the time they actually signed the armistice and when it actually takes effect. So I do like that they showed that. This, for me, was the most emotional scene of the entire movie, and it just wrecked me. We have Paul. First, he encounters this French soldier in this crater, and they're fighting hand to hand. He stabs him a bunch of times in the middle of fighting, and then he gets away from him, and the guy's like dying. He's gurgling and bleeding, and Paul tries to shut him up at first. He's like, "Shut up, shut up, shut up," and then he kind of dramatically changes his tune, and he starts trying to save the guy. He tries to treat his wounds, which there's no way he's going to be able to do that, and he tries to give him water. And then as soon as the guy dies, he says in French over and over again, "Je suis désolé, je suis désolé. I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And then he pulls out his papers, and he sees his name, and he sees a picture of the man's wife and child. And he tells him, "I'll let him know. I'll let him know. I'll go see them." It's just this heartbreaking scene that this man who's been on the front lines now for a year and a half has this up close and personal encounter with the enemy, who's just another human being. And this scene just gutted me watching this, and I'm so glad they showed it. It is a scene that's based on an encounter that happens in the book. It's brutal. It's brutal to watch. So now we go back to Erzberger, who is shining his shoes, and he's staring at a paper that says that the Kaiser abdicates. And this did actually happen. They did get word that the Kaiser had abdicated while they're in Compania for these negotiations, for these discussions. And Erzberger does receive a message from Hindenburg telling him, "Listen, just sign. Just sign no matter what. If you can't get any concessions out of them, fine. Just sign." That absolutely did happen. And one of the things that really angers me about Paul von Hindenburg is that despite the fact that he tells Erzberger, "You need to sign and end this war," he then turns around and becomes one of the people who says, "We were betrayed by the civilian leadership. We were betrayed. We could have continued fighting." No, you knew you couldn't continue fighting, and you were one of the people saying we need to end this war. So now we are at the morning of November 11th, 1918. It's around 4 or 5 in the morning that this stuff is all happening historically. And the German delegation comes in, and this is only the second time then that they're going to meet with Marshal Foch. And they're going to sit down, and Erzberger's basically going to explain to them, "Listen, we're going to sign this, but understand, we've got a brand new government taking over. The Kaiser's just abdicated. Everything's kind of up in the air, so we're going to do our best to fulfill this stuff, but you're going to have to be patient with us." And the initial armistice is supposed to last for about a month, and they have to extend it several times because it's not until January 1920 that the Treaty of Versailles is going to take effect. That's finally going to put an end to the war. And that's kind of what he's explaining here. And again, he's basically asking them, "Listen, can we end this right now?" And that's what happens historically. The Germans want the armistice to take effect the minute it's signed. And the Allies say, "No, we don't want that." And they actually order attacks on the morning of November 11, 1918. After the armistice has already been signed, they keep ordering attacks. And in the last hour of the war, you're going to have the last French soldier die. And I think the last French soldier dies at like a little over an hour before. You have a British soldier that dies like 15, 20 minutes before. And then generally understood, the last soldier to die on the Western Front is Henry Gunther, an American soldier, who dies at 10:59 while being waved off by German soldiers that he's charging towards. He had been demoted, and he was trying to get his honor back, basically, and he knew what he was doing. He knew the war was ending in a minute, and he charged anyway, and he fires at these German soldiers who return fire and kill him a minute before the end of the war. So here they are signing the armistice in this rail car. So now here we have, after the armistice has been signed, we have this general, again, this kind of like fictionalized, they're not real guy, who is giving this speech to them, basically saying, hey, yeah, the war's about to end, and if you want to be welcomed home as the heroes that you are for all you've achieved, then we can't tuck tail and run in the last moments. Before 11 o'clock, when this war ends, we're going to launch this attack, and we're going to show them who we are. And again, it's just ridiculous to me, because this is the kind of thing that would have been happening on the Allied side, not the German side. The Allies were the ones who were launching these stupid attacks on the last morning, not the Germans. So the last part of this movie is where they really kind of lose me with some of this stuff, because this just would not have been happening like this. And so then again, we have the same thing here. We have the French who are celebrating the end of the war. They're really not in any kind of a war footing. And all of a sudden they hear the sound of an attack coming, and they're surprised, and they're like, what's going on? Again, flip that script, and that's what you have. It would be the opposite happening. It would be the French attacking the Germans, not the other way around. And then our main character, Paul, is killed at the end. He's bayoneted in the last moments of the last attack of the war, which I will say this, at least, it does show us the utter waste of human life that World War I is. We see some of these guys die in ways that are just like, man, it wasn't even on the front lines. It wasn't even in a big attack. It's just stupid and pointless and horrible and awful. And that all does really encapsulate what this war was. So I believe from beginning to end, one of the things that this movie does really well is portray the senselessness of it all from start to finish. And one of the ongoing themes that we have is this piece of women's clothing that's been passed from one guy to another that just helps them kind of have that sense of home and sense of another life outside of the war. And it gives us kind of this postscript where it says, by the end of the war in November 1918, the front line had barely moved. And that's generally true, I guess, in a big sense. If you think of World War I on the Western Front as this stalemate of trench warfare, that's true except for the first few months and the last few months. You do have a lot of movement that happens in 1918 from the spring to the fall with the Kaiserschlacht attack and with the end of the war. But in the middle, yeah, you got about 3 years of movement, a little bit, a couple miles here, a couple miles there, a couple hundred meters there and here, things like that. But by and large, as I said at the beginning, as a standalone look at World War I really enjoyed this movie. And it gets more right than it gets wrong. As an adaptation of a book, it fails. And I really wish they had just used another title rather than All Quiet on the Western Front, because it created, I think, a certain expectation that it fails on. But I highly recommend it. Definitely watch it with the original German with subtitles in your language before you go back and watch it with the overdubbing. I hope that this leads to more. And I can tell you, without giving anything away too much, that I know for a fact we're getting a really, really good documentary about World War I coming out next year. Mostly is going to focus on the American involvement in the war. But that's all I'll say for the time being about that. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. Please hit that like button. Please add your own commentary, your own observations about the film. What did you think of it? What do you like? What do you not like? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.